This is another session about GDPR. I think the title outside doesn't say it in detail, but actually this is again around GDPR. So we are trying to get a little bit more specific. So you had the panel which was a great introduction into GDPR, code of conduct, etc. This is another session on GDPR, and as I said, we are trying to get a little bit more specific on that. So my name is Christian Hesse. So you might hear from my accent that I'm not a native English speaker, but I'm from Germany. And my role at AWS is focusing on data protection regulations, of course, at the moment, especially on GDPR. So let's start. I don't think that I have to explain what actually GDPR is. I think everybody is aware that this is coming effective on the 25th of May. I think what's quite important, I think we as a European know that is basically the harmonization of data protection regulations across Europe. I think that's a great benefit because so far each member of the European Union had their own regulations. So if you were dealing with different countries, so processing data of people from different European countries, you always had to somehow look into the local regulations and, of course, have to apply that. I think this is going away now with GDPR. So the member states are in the process of implementing GDPR into their local regulation. Germany, for example, has done that already. There are, I think, as well, a couple of others who did, or some who are in the process. As well, I think what is great that data protection regulation was not the regulation per se in the member states, but there were also other regulations and laws affected. So there are social laws, there are maybe hospital laws, etc. And they all had their own piece of data protection regulation, and that might differ from what the general data protection regulations was in this member state. And I think GDPR is now aligning this as well. So this is what we see in Germany, that now the hospital laws we have on a state level, as well the social laws, etc., that they're all getting aligned to the GDPR. I think that makes it easier for all of us to provide services and process personal data. All right. So talking about data, I think you know GDPR is about personal data, but I want to explain the difference. So there's content on the one hand, and there's personal data on the other hand. Of course, GDPR is focusing on the personal data, but when you look into our documentation, as well when you look into our data processing agreements, you never will read about personal data. You always will read about content, customer content. And for us, because AWS is content agnostic, so we don't know if this file or this content contains personal data, we always talk about content, customer content, and not about personal data. And we protect the data equally. So we don't know if this is a cat photo, or if this is really some kind of name, email address, etc. So it's all protected equally. So let me start with an announcement. I think we heard it this morning in the panel. I want to not to marketing this, but as well to explain a little bit how we achieved that the AWS services are ready, GDPR ready. So I will explain when we come to the requirements of the GDPR, explain a little bit what we did in this area. But I think it's an important message that all AWS services already are GDPR compliant. So that means that we somehow finished the project on GDPR readiness. Of course, it's never finished. Of course, we continue with it. But so about a month ago, we said, okay, so the services are ready now, looking into the requirements. So what are the requirements of GDPR? As I said, I will be a little bit more specific. I think these four are very important ones. So the first one which is affecting us, but also, of course, you as a customer, so as a controller or even as a processor, is the right to data portability. So that means that a data subject has the right to get his data back, or that his data could be moved in any meaningful format. Yeah? So if you're processing data subject's personal data and the contract, for example, expires, the data subject could come to you and ask for his data to be returned, for example. The next one, the right to be forgotten, I think also a very important one. That's actually the right of deletion. So as well, either a data subject could come to you and say, hey, please delete my data. Or, for example, if the contract expires, there's an obligation for the controller that the data has to be deleted within a certain amount of time. The third one is the privacy by design. I think it's a concept which is a little bit new, and it's especially different because it's really went into the regulation. So that you have to delete data, or that you have to offer some kind of portability mechanism. I think that's natural that this is written in a regulation, but a privacy by design, actually a guidance that when you develop applications, when you set up systems, that you have to have data protection and all these requirements in mind. I think this is pretty new, and I think it's also somehow helpful for those who are developing IT systems, who are planning to process personal data, so that you from beginning, because it's somehow required by the law, from the beginning you always have to have data protection, GDPR in mind. So you have to make sure that that you are able to delete the data, you are able to port the data, and we will see some other requirements later on. And another one, data breach notification. It's not entirely new, so we already had data breach notifications in several regulations across the European Union, but now with GDPR, it's getting very precise, I would say. Yeah? Precise means, so there's really a time frame when the controller has to inform the authorities that there has been a data breach, so it's 72 hours. Very important, that's an obligation of the data controller. Of course, you have to work together with the processor. So for example, if the processor recognizes that there is a data breach, and maybe the controller doesn't, of course, the processor has to inform the controller, and after the controller has been informed, the clock starts ticking, and then there are 72 hours till this breach has to be notified to the authorities. So how can AWS help with GDPR compliance? So first of all, let's look into the structure. So what scenarios do we have? I think this was also touched in the panel this morning. Those who are actually providing their personal data, they are defined as data subjects. So that could be a consumer, that could be employees of a company who is running application or storing data in your application or on AWS. So, but those are actually those who are providing their personal information. And then there are two parties, and it's important there's a box around that. That means they both have to work together and they both have obligations. So there's from our point of view, there's the customer, who is the controller. So who is actually collecting the data, who is doing things with the data, who is deciding what data will be stored there, what happens with the data. And there's AWS. We are the data processor, so we are providing the processing technologies, the processing facilities, etc. As I said, very important, both have obligations, and I already explained a little bit about the data breach notification. There has to be some close relationship, I would say. Yeah? So you really have to work together with your processor, and you have to be confident that this teamwork is working well. So there's another scenario. Again, we have the data subject, and then we have, again, AWS as the processor. But then we have a customer, and that could be you. For example, you are running or providing an application, etc. And then there's the data controller. So this scenario is very likely in a software as a service environment, or in a ISVs, so independent software vendors, who are offering their application, their services on top of AWS. In this case, actually, we are providing the infrastructure. The ISV or the SaaS provider is providing the application. And the data, so the personal data of the data subjects, are uploaded and managed then by the controller, which could be, for example, a company. Who is using then this application or this service, so that could also be the case. Transferring content, I know that there have been myths for many years that personal data cannot leave a country or that personal data cannot leave the EU. This is not the case. For many years now, we already had mechanisms that there is a transfer possible, so personal data could be accessed from outside the EU, or even could be stored or transferred the EU. We heard this morning that AWS is not transferring any data, any personal data, if you choose, for example, the region in Frankfurt, in Paris, or any other European location. But if you're planning to do this, maybe to use another region, a data center outside the EU, there are mechanisms to legally transfer that kind of data. So with the US, I think you heard about the EU-US Privacy Shield framework. That's basically the mechanisms how to transfer the high level of data protection we have here in Europe to the US. So the US processor then has to adhere to the privacy shield and actually has to meet the same high bar of data protection as we have here in the EU. There are other mechanisms, the standard contractual clauses. They are relevant for, I would say, the rest of the world, of course, for the US as well, if you like to, but for all other countries who do not have the adequacy decision, and that's a standard contractual clauses is a contract provided by the EU Commission and by the authorities, and this is basically the same mechanisms that you are transferring the high level of data protection to this third country, and you have to sign then this contract with this third party outside the EU, and basically then you have this high level of data protection. There is also a third mechanism called the binding corporate rules. They are not used that much if it comes really to a, I would say, controller processor. So if you really out-task something, binding corporate rules are many times used with intercompany transfers, so large corporations use binding corporate rules. The reason for that is that you have to develop and agree on them with the authorities, so it's nothing standardized like the privacy shield or the standard contractual clauses, so they are individually and you have to get them confirmed and approved by the authorities. So it is actually, it is possible to transfer data. As I said, AWS, if you choose a region here in the European Union, we will not transfer your data outside the EU. So we talked about some basic requirements, some very important requirements of the GDPR. I think also a very important other part of GDPR are the technical organizational measures. When I talk to customers outside the EU, I many times get the question, so when I do encrypt my data, so I'm GDPR compliant. No, you're not. So encryption is not enough. What certification do I need to get GDPR compliant? There are certifications which is helping with the technical organizational measures, but you're not automatically GDPR compliant. I think so the concept is new, that a regulation consists out of technical and security measures, but as well of a legal part. So you always need both. So you need some kind of contract in place where you define the processing, where you define the scope, the purpose, etc. But on the other hand, you also have to take care about the protection of the data through technical measures. And we have four major pillars in the GDPR. The first one, this is somehow related to encryption, is the pseudonymization and encryption of personal data. Of course, we also have the concept of anonymization. So if data is anonymized, actually then GDPR does not apply, because then it's not considered as personal data anymore. But if you, I would say, only encrypt data, so you pseudonymize data, of course GDPR still applies. So the second pillar is to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, the integrity, availability, and resilience of the processing systems and services. The third one, the ability to restore availability and access to personal data in a timely manner. Very important. And the fourth one, process for regularly testing, assessing, evaluating the effectiveness of the terms. So these are the four pillars, and we will look into this, how AWS can help, especially in the area of technical and organizational measures. So there are some areas I think we can help, and which is addressing all these requirements. So first of all, we have tools and services. Yeah, we will look into some tools which can help address specific requirements. Then, of course, we have the compliance framework, which is especially important for the fourth pillar. Here, so the regular testing, assessing, and evaluating of the effectiveness. Of course, you can implement all these measures and say, okay, my data is secure, but you also somehow have to prove this to your customers. And as well, I think it makes sense to also have some kind of third-party check if this is really the case. And for this, the compliance framework on our side, but maybe also on the customer side, is quite important. We have partners. You heard this morning, for example, Trend Micro, who is helping in this area, and we will see some more. And of course, the data protection terms. So let me start with the data protection terms. As I said, GDPR is not only pure technical, so protecting personal data with technical measures, but also there's always this legal part. As I said, you have to define the purpose of the data processing. You have to define how you handle subcontractors, how you handle inspections, etc., etc. And this is a legal part and could not be replaced by technical measures. So therefore, if two companies, so that's usually the case, if two companies going into a data processing relationship, they sign a data processing agreement, which is covering all these areas, as I mentioned, as well somehow describing the technical and organizational measures. So this is what usually companies do. If you deal with consumers, I think we also heard this morning, you are more looking into the consent area, so that you get somehow consent to process the personal data of the data subject. AWS is offering for all our enterprise agreement customers the data processing agreement. So this is a data protection contract you could get, check, and basically sign. And for those who don't have enterprise agreements, we are updating our services terms with privacy terms, and they apply then automatically. So there's nothing to do. You can get into your console, can then check, so they will be available, I think, in the next couple of days or next 2 weeks, I would say. And you can go into your console, get into the services terms, and then you find the privacy terms, which then are applying GDPR. All right. So let's look into the obligations of both sides. So we go a little bit more in detail. You saw that in the so the shared responsibility model you saw in the Trend Micro session. There was also a discussion or a question about this in the panel this morning. I think it's quite important that because there are, you remember the box around the controller and the processor, that both have to work together. And that's the reason why the shared responsibility model is not changing. Yeah? In the shared responsibility, both as well the provider, AWS, and the customer had to work together on a technical level, but this is also true for data protection regulations. So that's the reason why the shared responsibility model is still true. So let's look a little bit more in detail about the obligations. So who is responsible for what when we look into the requirements of GDPR? So of course, the legal compliance, as I said, GDPR is explicitly mentioning and naming both the processor and as well the controller to be compliant to GDPR. The whole area of system security and data protection by design, of course, both are responsible. I mean, this is what we actually did when I started to explain that our services are already GDPR ready. So we did an assessment. So of course we didn't start from scratch because there were already data protection regulations in place, and our services already complied to those. For example, the German ones or the Spanish ones or other ones in Europe. And as I said, GDPR is not completely new. It's a harmonization. So that's the reason why we didn't start from scratch. But of course, our systems were already able to delete data. There were functionalities to port data. Also, the privacy by design was already implemented. So when we came up with new services, we always, of course, had in mind that this has to apply to data protection regulations in the EU. So this, of course, applies for both. Then records of processing activities as well. Both. I think it's a very important topic. So that's Article 30 of the GDPR. We will talk about this in a minute as well. The encryption as well is an obligation of both. Yeah? Of course, in our case, AWS is more providing the technology, the functionality to encrypt data, and the controller or processor, so actually who's using AWS, has to make sure to either turn it on or implement the encryption in their applications. Managing data subject consent, of course, I discussed it or I mentioned it. This is the legal relationship between the data controller and the data subject. This is the obligation of the controller. The management of personal data deletion as well, both controller and processor. The processor has to provide, as well AWS has to provide the technical functionality to enable you to delete data, and then the controller has to actually delete the data. So if you get a request from a data subject to delete data, you go into your console or into your environment and delete data, and we in the backend as the AWS make sure that the data is actually deleted. Managing personal data portability, this is the responsibility of the controller, which means as you as a controller or the controllers in general are managing the data, and as well you somehow have the legal relationship with the data subject directly, and the data subject comes to you and is asking for his data, then it's your obligation to provide this information and the personal data back to the data subject. But again, of course, AWS is helping with interfaces and self-service mechanisms that you actually can get out the data of AWS or your application or your database or whatever. And of course, the security of personal data, it is, when you look into the regulations, it is the responsibility of the controller. But again, this is also a joint effort. So we have to provide you with a relevant and adequate technology and mechanisms that you are able to protect and secure the data of the data subjects. So what are the tools and the functionalities we are providing? You see a variety of that. We will dig into some of them in the next slides. So let's start with data access control. As well, explicitly mentioned in GDPR that the data controller has to control the access to personal data. And we are providing a range of functionalities and tools, etc. There are mentioned some like the multi-factor authentication, API request authentication, temporary access tokens. But the basis for all of those access control mechanisms is IAM, so Identity and Access Management System. So I think it was also mentioned in the session this morning by Trent Michael. So this is really fundamental, and this is the basis, yeah, to get the IAM right. So first of all, of course, to implement it, to get it right from a technical perspective, but also from an organizational perspective. So that means you have to come up with processes, who manages the IAM, who decides who gets access to what resources, etc. So as I said, it's not only a technical effort, it's also an organizational effort. So if not done yet, maybe do some workshops, do some thinking about how you set up and implement IAM in the right way. Of course, this could differ depending on the applications, depending on the data you're processing or storing. But I think this is really fundamental, and this is also I think a very important part of the privacy by design. Really to think about who has access to your systems, and as well, of course, how you can prevent unauthorized access. The next one, I think also an extremely important one. That's the monitoring of access activities, not only access, but in general processing activities. Yeah? So if you look into Article 30 of GDPR, I think it's quite well described what is required here. But I think to put this into practice is not that easy. If your on-premise have different data silos or even different system silos, it is not easy to monitor all these different silos, and as well monitoring all the processing activities and access to data. You're using, I don't know, SAN storage, you're using NAS storage, you're using direct attached storage, you're using different databases. You all have to somehow collect that data from all these different sources and have to, basically in real time, have to see what is happening, who has access to this information, and how the data is processed. We as AWS have a tool called CloudTrail, also mentioned twice today, but I think this is very important because CloudTrail is not monitoring some kind of system logs, but actually it's monitoring API calls. So everything what happens with data in AWS is always an API call. So if you store your data, files or whatever in S3, so the storage service, and this data is accessed or this data is removed or anything happens with this file or with this data, this is always an API call. As well, everything what happens in databases, that's always an API call. And CloudTrail is actually logging all this information, and then you can use these logs and get basically in real time meaningful information out of this. And I think this is then actually really complying or helping to comply with the requirements of Article 30. And I think a solution like this makes it much more easier to comply with the regulation because, as said, CloudTrail is across all our services, so we are not working in silos, so that CloudTrail, for example, is available for the one service, but not for the other service. So if you are thinking about moving workloads to the cloud, to AWS, I think especially in the area of access monitoring and processing monitoring, CloudTrail is helping a lot. There's another tool called Amazon Guard Duty. Very important. There are more tools. I'm just picking out some of them. Guard Duty is a tool which is helping to detect threats. So this is more in the area of unauthorized access to data. A tool which is also implemented deeply in our services. So it's not much effort to configure it. It's basically turning it on. And then Guard Duty is analyzing or monitoring your environment, so your resources on AWS on threats. And of course, you can define alarms, etc. Of course, you can get those data from CloudTrail, but as well from Guard Duty out of the AWS platform. If you are planning to use another monitoring system, or you have your own security incident management system, so you can get all this data and feed them in there. But of course, there are tools also available to do the monitoring and get the alerts. The third one, data encryption. I think that's very natural. So we are providing different kinds of encryption. Again, encryption is also explicitly mentioned in the regulation. It's not a hard requirement, so the regulation does not say you have to encrypt data. So you shall encrypt data, but from my point of view, I think it's a very fundamental way to protect data. So to use encryption to prevent data breaches. So even if somebody gets access to your systems and is getting data out, if the data is encrypted, there is a very, very high chance that the data is actually not breached, so the content itself. AWS is offering encryption, so I would say 2 levels of that. The first is the key management service. So AWS is running our own key management service, which on the one hand could be turned on for existing services. So for example, if you store data files on a S3 service, on the storage service, you can turn on encryption. The KMS, so the key management system, is providing you then individual keys for your S3 buckets and is encrypting the data in there. So that's the first possibility. The second possibility is to use Cloud HSM, which is also an encryption service, but which gives you a little more control over the keys. So in KMS, basically the keys are managed. I have to quote that because keys are not really managed, but they are managed by AWS. So our systems are creating the keys, are providing the keys. With Cloud HMS, you have more control. That means you can, for example, provide your own keys. So if you also have encryption modules on site, you can create your own keys, import those keys into the Cloud HSM, so in the HSM modules, and then those keys would be used for the encryptions. That would give you control how long the key is valid, so you can revoke the keys, etc., etc. This is not possible in KMS, but this is possible with Cloud HSM. So I explained that you can turn on encryption for certain services. You can also use it in RDS, so in database services for certain types of database. But you also can use KMS or Cloud HSM if you want to implement encryption in your application. So if you're building your application, you can use this service then to get the keys managed, and then use the keys to encrypt data in your application, etc. All right, the last one, strong compliance framework. As well, part of GDPR, it's also mentioned there. I think also an important topic, because as I said, you somehow have to, on the one hand, prove to the outside that you have adequate mechanisms in place, but you also somehow have to prove yourself that what you are doing is the right way and is protecting data in the right way. That's the reason we are coming back to the shared responsibility model. Basically, we as AWS providing or having or are certified on several certifications and standards and schemes. I think from my point of view, very relevant for implementing, improving technical organizational measures in the regards to data protection are the ISO certifications. They are somehow a standard now, I would say. You see them basically everywhere as well. When you, I would say, talk to authorities and you mention ISO, they know, okay, ISO, I know. And there are already specific ones, country-specific ones. I want to name one, that's the C5 attestation in Germany. That's a attestation or a framework provided by the BSI, so the German Authority for Security and Information Technology. I think we will see more in other member states. I think France is also working on a standard which is comparable with C5, but as well C5 is based on the ISO certification. That's the reason why I said the ISO, to go with the ISO, it's a very good idea because it's some kind of a became a standard in implementing technical and organizational measures when it comes to data centers, when it comes to IT operations, etc. Especially here the 27018, which is specifically focusing on protecting personal data. So it's both. So it's 27018 is not a standard alone. It's basically a subset. So you go with the 27.1, for example, and then you do another, depending on how many controls you're choosing, I don't know, 20 to 40 controls on top, which is then the 27018. This is what AWS is doing, and I think it makes sense as a processor or a controller of personal data to also think about looking into those certifications or even get certified or testified. So we have, of course, the ISO. I talked about this. We heard about the SOC. Which is not that common here in Europe, but I think it's really a good standard because it's much more descriptive. It's much more individual than the ISO standards, because the ISO standards, it's predefined controls, and you implement those controls and will be tested against the controls. The SOC is more individual, and I think Tim Rains explained this morning that it's really a long period of auditing. So the auditor is sitting in your data center or is looking at your application or processing for about 6 months. And then, of course, we have the third one. We also heard about this in the panel, and that's the code of conduct. And I have a slide especially on the CISP, but I think they are also becoming very relevant with GDPR. All right. Code of conduct, we already heard from Francisco Miguerons, I don't know who had joined the panel this morning, about the CISP code of conduct. So I definitely, or AWS definitely welcomes this approach of code of conduct. I don't know, many of you might have been in the area of data protection regulations for many years, and you might know the problem. Is there a certification for data protection regulations? So officially approved by the authorities. So in Germany, for example, we haven't had anything like this. So we had always some kind of certifications going in this direction, but they were not fully covered by the law, so that the German data protection regulation says, okay, you can do this certification or this code of conduct, and then you're compliant. It was always the part, this is the technical organizational measures. You got some guidance from the authorities, and as well the legal part, where you also got some guidance, but actually you always had to read through the legal part, and you really have to dig deep into the technical part. And I think that the concept of code of conduct, which is now really came into the regulation, is helping here a lot, especially as a customer, if you don't have the deep expertise either on the legal side or as well on the technical side, because those fancy animation. 1 second, okay. Because those code of conducts, they also consist out of a legal part, but also defining the security and technical measures. And the nice thing about this, they should be approved or have to be approved by the authorities that they're becoming relevant. So Francisco this morning explained about the CISP code of conduct. So that's the cloud infrastructure code of conduct. AWS joined already a couple of months or years ago. And this code of conduct is consisting out of the legal part and as well the technical and the security part of it. This code of conduct has been provided to the authorities, to the Article 29 working party, and they looked at it and they came back and said, okay, in general, that's the right direction, but look into this and this and this, and you might have to change this and this area. And this is now done by this organization, and they will resubmit the code of conduct. And then, of course, seeking for approval. But when this code of conduct is approved, and you have a cloud infrastructure provider like AWS, for example, who adhere or is CISP certified. This basically shows you that this cloud infrastructure provider is GDPR compliant. As well, from a legal point of view, so all the terms like the purpose, subcontractors, all that stuff, but also from the technical and organizational measures point of view. And I think this is a great achievement, of course, on the one hand for the cloud infrastructure providers, because they can actually show that they apply or comply with the regulation, but also for customers because they don't have to individual dig into the legal area and as well on the technical organizational measures area, because this gives them some security in this space. I talked about partners. We heard this morning Trend Micro, that they are also providing services, schemes, which help with GDPR compliance. There are many others. I think many of them have a GDPR offering. I talked about monitoring, for example, and that you can export those results of the monitoring of CloudTrail to also other systems. Splunk would be one of those vendors where you can feed this information in, you can create alerts, etc., etc. But there are many, many more who can help all with addressing GDPR requirements. We also have consulting partners in this area. On the left side, I think well known in Europe, we have, for example, Deloitte. We have Direktgruppe, which is more focused on Germany, and we have Soprasteria. I think it's also important to look for consulting partners who can do both. So that means they can help you on the legal side, but they can also help you on the technical and organizational measures side. I think so. If you're starting, if you haven't really went through all the requirements, the legal analysis, etc., then I think those partners are good. If you're already pretty confident on the legal side, you also can look into those partners on the right side, which are more on the technical side, so they really can help you to implement encryption, to implement monitoring, etc., etc. We also have AWS professional services who can help, so they usually start with a one-day workshop. We also heard about the concept of well-architected workshops, so they will really look into either into your existing environment or into your plans, and then we'll basically put in some GDPR flavor into it and say, okay, this is the right way how you architect it, or you should architect in that way, and you have to make sure that you turn on encryption in that case, or you use keys in your application, and all these kind of things. AWS professional services could help you with. All right. And we have a lot of resources. So what I just explained, in short, I would say we also have more details, information, and documentation about this on our so-called GDPR Center. You see the URL above there. We have white papers which really go more in detail what I just explained. We have FAQs there, how we address certain things, how we handle certain things, etc. So I hope that was a good overview for you. If you have questions, I don't know if you have. I don't think we have a microphone, but we have. Okay. So then, if you have questions, feel free. Yeah, there we have the first one.
How do you handle the right to be forgotten in combination with RDS snapshots?
Yeah, there is documentation available, so it is possible to not only delete maybe the database instance itself, but also the snapshots. So that would mean a complete deletion of that snapshot. Right. Okay, yeah, and of course, in this case, you have to delete it in the database. And I don't know how your retention policy is for your snapshots. Of course, this is difficult. You cannot delete data sets, single data sets in a snapshot. I don't know if you, for example, keep the snapshots for 30 days or something, and then you delete them. And of course, the new snapshot you're creating, you already deleted the data set. Yeah, right. But this is, as I said, this is the definition you have to make how long you keep the data. Yeah. And I haven't read in the regulation that if you delete the data, it has to be immediately deleted. Of course, there are technical restrictions when it comes to data deletion, but of course you have to make sure that it is deleted in a, I don't know, meaningful time, so you cannot keep this then for months or years or something. Of course, you have to make sure that even if this data is stored in a snapshot, it has to be deleted in a reasonable time. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're working with an ISV that processes personal data and is certified by AWS, I assume they have some kind of certification. Does that certification include some kind of GDPR assessment? GDPR compliance assessment?
So the question was, if we certify this ISV, or?
Yes.
Sorry. So first of all, we do not certify. So we have this the certification as explained, the ISO, the C5, etc. And ISVs or customers can do their own certification on top of that. We already have examples of ISVs who did this. Salesforce, for example, Box.com, for example, they, for example, have a C5 certification on top of our certification. So usually the auditor will then look into our audit reports, yeah, and will check especially the layer, so shared responsibility layer, shared responsibility model, the layer AWS is responsible for, and say, okay, this area from a C5 perspective is checked, and then the auditor is looking into the application and the operations of the ISV, and then is looking if this C5 attestation, for example, or the ISO certification could be granted. But this is on top, and it has to be your own audit. So it's not that AWS can do that, or that you can say, oh, because AWS has this ISO certification, I'm automatically also ISO certified. So you can say, the data centers, for example, and all the infrastructure AWS is providing, this is ISO certified, but the area you are responsible for has to be certified as well.